If you guys know a thing or two about Russia, then you might know that a lot of Russians, and especially Russian boomers, really love the Soviet Union and have a ton of Soviet nostalgia. If you go online, it's pretty easy to see countless videos in which Russians on the streets are being asked whether life was better in the Soviet Union or in Russia of today.
Ну, понятно.
СССР лучше.
При СССР лучше?
Да.
Почему было лучше?
Почему?
Все дружнее были, сплоченнее и интереснее и веселее.
And pretty much most of the time, anybody that is over the age of 45 or 50 would tell you that the Soviet Union was much better to live in. In fact, it seems like a lot of Russian boomers are not only very in love with the Soviet Union, but are also usually rejecting such terms as democracy or freedom.
Демократия, по вашему мнению, что это такое?
Ну, власть народа.
Обман людей, ну, демократия это как бы придуманное понятие, ну, американское вот это понятие, которое привели. Как бы я считаю то, что это, ну, обман, ЛГБТЕ, поведение. Это разве это демократия, мне кажется?
Ooh, yes guys, we've met propaganda brain right here. This is him. So, what's up guys, it is your boy Roman, your favorite neighborhood Russian, and in today's video guys, we are going to be getting to the bottom of why a lot of Russian boomers love the Soviet Union so much. Now, to be fair, I have to point out one thing, and that is that Soviet nostalgia is actually not only limited to Russia. In fact, a lot of people in different post-Soviet countries, especially those post-Soviet countries that did not really have a very successful story after the fall of the Soviet Union and ended up being pretty poor, a lot of the people from these countries will tell you that the Soviet Union was actually better.
Я при СССР. Мне хватило все, вот эту зарплату. Я работал в предприятии простым инженером. Но все равно вот это и хватило мне и мою семью. Сейчас что, куда, что? Все расхватили, цены бешеные, работы нет, того нет.
So yes, Soviet nostalgia is actually far more widespread than you might think it is. However, only in Russia is the Soviet nostalgia essentially weaponized and is basically used as a tool of propaganda, which makes the current government fit in very well with the beliefs of these people that are longing for the Soviet Union. So, when we talk about Soviet nostalgia, we have to understand that the period that people are usually being nostalgic about is usually starting somewhere from the late 50s, which was already a time of Stalin's death, and when the Soviet Union was already slowly getting over the Second World War, and that period usually ends somewhere in the mid or early 80s. So pretty much before the Perestroika, before Gorbachev, and before the fall of the Soviet Union. That is in general the time that people have the most nostalgia for. Specifically, I would say the 70s, because that's where the majority of the greatest Soviet movies ever were filmed. Ирония судьбы или с легким паром, Служебный роман, Москва слезам не верит, Мимино, etc. I would say probably the 70s is the quintessential Soviet nostalgia period. So, let's get into the reason number one, and that reason is that the Soviet boomers just think that life was pretty good. Here's the thing, when you talk about the Soviet Union, most people basically just see a terrible regime that killed its own people and obviously didn't allow for any flourishing of normal life. Well, actually that was not really the case. A lot of people, especially people living in large cities, basically lived a pretty normal, pretty comfortable life, especially around the 70s. And yes, a lot of the people that are being nostalgic for the Soviet Union tend to kind of forget the Afghanistan war that happened in this decade. But that is basically the thing about nostalgia, because a lot of people just forget about everything bad that existed during that time and only remember the good things. But this is kind of how human psychology works. And the main things that the Soviet boomers usually would tell you when they describe this time is that we had free housing, free education, free healthcare, and the greatest food and groceries of all time. And this is actually kind of a meme at this point, but yes, every single Soviet boomer loves to tell how the food in the Soviet Union was incredible, that every single product that you could get back in the Soviet Union was just so infinitely better in its quality compared to what you get today in Russia and capitalism and freedom and democracy. Soviet boomers always go on about how great the kolbasa was back in the day, how great Soviet ice cream was, how great Soviet soft drinks were, how great Soviet beer was. Essentially, any type of food that the Soviet Union had was just the greatest, and it was just of the greatest quality. The Soviet boomers might forget that the amount of these particular, delicacies that they could consume back in the day was way smaller compared to what you could get today. However, once again, people tend to forget the bad and only remember the good. And also, let's be completely fair, the majority of Russian boomers today are just completely broke because their pensions are completely laughable. So they cannot even afford good products in the first place under capitalism, so that's why they think that everything that existed in the Soviet Union was basically definitely of better quality. And that is kind of the logic of a lot of the arguments you're gonna hear from these people. People in Russia, especially the elderly, are just very poor, and they just can't afford to do anything anymore. For example, a vacation is just not affordable for a lot of people. However, back in the Soviet Union, if you worked at a factory and you worked well, then you would be able to get a special ticket and actually get to travel somewhere. This could be basically anything. This could range from, you know, taking a trip to a baza отдыха somewhere at a nearby lake in the region where you live, or it could be like a trip somewhere in the Soviet Union. You could even possibly get like a ticket to Yugoslavia and visit that. In fact, my grandma, for example, she's worked at the Chelyabinsk tractor plants, and somewhere in the 70s or the 80s, I'm not exactly sure, she actually got to visit Yugoslavia via a trip she got from her job. So not bad, right? Yugoslavia is pretty cool. Certainly much cooler than what you have today, where you basically, you know, have absolute pennies and you can't even afford to go on a vacation to Moscow even. I'm pretty sure that you must see the logic of these people, right?
А вы помните прекрасно советский власть, наверное, когда было при СССР здесь? Да. А что вы думаете про это время? Была жизнь лучше?
В брежневское время вот такое было.
Да? Брежнев, да?
Отлично было время. Люди радостные, свободные были, катались, отдыхали.
In the Soviet Union, you had your healthcare, you had your school, you had your job, and you had your nice little amenities that you wouldn't get very often, however, you would get them. In a capitalist system though, if you just don't have money, you will never go on a vacation, you know? So obviously in the eyes of the Soviet boomer, that is 1.0 to the Soviet Union versus Russia. Now let's talk about reason number 2, and that reason is that everything just got severely worse after the fall of the Soviet Union. The 1990s in Russia and other post-Soviet countries as well was a very unhappy, very scary time. First of all, Russia, and actually a ton of other post-Soviet states as well, were plagued by endless crime, lawlessness, and just an overall feeling of disrepair and disarrangements in pretty much everything. And to some degree, Russia during the 90s was basically kind of a failed state as well. Once again, terrible crime rates, a lot of gangs, insane inflation and poverty, constant political crisis, for example what happened in 1994 in Russia with Yeltsin. And of course, like I already said, there were a ton of regional conflicts popping up everywhere. Thankfully, of course, to the very brilliant borders that the Soviet Union has come up with. There were conflicts on the territory of Russia as well, for example in Chechnya. Basically, if you lived somewhere in the ex-Soviet Union in the 90s, your life was pretty much not very fun. And yes, a lot of people's lives basically got ruined as a result of the USSR falling apart. And I know it's kind of a joke at this point to even mention this, but yes, Vladimir Putin once said that the fall of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of people will agree with it. Basically, for a lot of people who lived through the 90s and also lived in the Soviet Union, the 90s have left an impression that essentially it was a terrible time, and the reason why it was a terrible time is because it was the time of freedom under the rule of liberals. And a lot of people's view on this is basically, yeah, we know what all this freedom and liberalism stands for. When we had freedom and liberalism, our life was terrible. And yes, I'm not really defending the 90s, however, what's missed a lot of the time is that the usual conclusion, the usual sort of opinion here is that Vladimir Putin, who came into power after the 90s, was the strong leader that actually, you know, sort of helped to revive Russia's economy and actually lead Russia to become a functioning country, right? And actually what's really interesting is that it could be argued that a lot of the inflation and the poverty of the 1990s in Russia obviously was there because they just transitioned from communism to capitalism. And actually there's a view that a lot of the economic reforms that were done in the 90s actually laid the groundwork for Russia's economic success in the early 2000s. So this economic upsurge was actually not the work of Vladimir Putin. However, in people's heads, the 90s was a terrible time led by freedom and liberals, and then Vladimir Putin came and brought with himself a sort of a new order to Russia, and we can actually live like a decent life now, whatever. Because essentially what Russian propaganda does is that it juxtaposes the liberal free years of the 90s, which were poor, you know, full of crime and just terrible things, war, etc. They compare that to the, you know, 2000s and 2010s and the rest, whatever, under Vladimir Putin, who finally, you know, grabbed the country into firm hands, shook off all the liberal traitors and everybody who's talking about freedom and democracy, whatever, you know, those made up terms by the West, of course. And essentially by doing this propaganda, they solidify the belief that the reason why Russia was failing in the 90s is because of the so-called freedom and democracy. And essentially these terms such as freedom and democracy became derogatory for some people in Russia. Screw this so-called American freedom. It's already turned into permissiveness. This is what they drove their people to with their freedom. May God protect us from this nightmare. And actually, if you go online and if you read some arguments, when suggested that Russia needs to be more liberal and free, a lot of these Putin fans usually respond with, "Oh yeah, we've seen your freedom and democracy. Do you want us to live like in the 90s again? I am never going back to that. I know what your freedom and democracy truly means." And now let's get into the reason number 3, and the reason is that a lot of old people pretty much everywhere just tend to be nostalgic for their youth and the so-called good old times. When their penis works, basically, you know, that's pretty much what it is. This is pretty common in many countries of the world, you know, for example, America or Europe, etc. I feel like boomers and old people just tend to always kind of want to go back to when they were young, when things were great, when the grass was greener and, you know, the birds were singing louder or whatever. I think being reactionary is kind of like a basic feature of any boomer at this point, so that's why pretty much, you know, in Europe, you get these boomers that have these, you know, racist opinions, a lot of them saying that we need to go back to the things they were before. In Europe, you know, we need to bring old Europe back. Or in America, for example, you have, you know, whatever, any other movements that would be, you know, trying to vaguely bring back the old days. For example, MAGA, Make America Great Again, Trump, that's pretty much in the fucking name. But yes, that's really just the thing. The majority of boomers that are nostalgic for the Soviet Union, most of these people, they're not even like devout communists or Marxists or something, because the majority of people in pretty much every country don't know shit about politics and don't know what anything means, right? So yes, for a lot of these Soviet people, it's not even just so that they think that, you know, communism or like Marxism, Leninism is great. Leninism. I'm literally having a brain aneurysm right now, guys, I'm sorry. But no, it's not even that. For the majority of these people, they just think, oh, I remember my youth, you know, life was great, and that was the time back in the day when girls liked me and when my penis worked. I wanna go back to the Soviet Union. Having said that though, I do have to say that in Russia these days, there's definitely a resurgence of a new sort of leftist movement that is fond of the Soviet Union, but in a different way. And this movement, I would say, is pretty like adjacent to the tankies. And in Russia these days, there's definitely a sort of a new leftist pro-Soviet movement being brewed as well. And there are a bunch of very popular Russian YouTubers now, for example, that actually, you know, describe themselves as Marxist-Leninists and provide an analysis of current events from a sort of a Marxist point of view. So yes, I'm not trying to say that every single Soviet supporter, you know, is just, you know, a stupid boomer that just wants to go back there because that was the time where his face didn't look like a like a tree or whatever. But also there's some people that genuinely, you know, have nostalgia and support the Soviet Union based on ideological reasons, and young people in particular. So yes, essentially Russia has all sorts of geniuses. So yes, those are, in my opinion, some of the main reasons why some Russians, especially Russian boomers, tend to sort of idolize and actually be very nostalgic about the Soviet Union. Once again, I'm not pretending this is like a full list. I may be saying complete nonsense, but this is just pretty much just based on what I think is true. So hopefully you guys did enjoy today's video. If you guys did, then please make sure to slap the like on it. Also, if you guys do want to support me additionally, then you could go to the link down in the description and become a YouTube member. It's basically like a Patreon type thing, like a monthly donation. It helps me out a lot. It's the best way to support me. Or if you want to do a one-time donation, you can also use super thanks underneath this video. Anyways guys, that is going to be pretty much it for today's video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.